Hello there everybody, Sam's Trains here, welcome back to the railway and welcome to another review. Today I'm looking at a new Steam release from Hornby. Weirdly, I've been really looking forward to this one. This model is nothing majorly special, but it's just such a classic vintage model. It's quite exciting to see it back in the Hornby range. So the loco is, of course, the Hornby LBSC E2 locomotive in the classic SECR green. What? Okay, so the elephant in the room is that SECR green is not an E2 livery. And while you know and I know that this is definitely the old Hornby E2 model, Hornby have made no mention of this being an E2 locomotive, and if we look at the end of the box later on, you will see again no mention of this being an E2. And how strange that is. Why are they not calling this what it is, an E2? Well, I think it actually makes quite a lot of sense. I don't think it's anything to do with Thomas licensing. I think as long as this didn't have a Thomas face, as long as it didn't look an awful lot like Thomas, it wasn't called Thomas, I think they could still sell this as an E2. I don't think it's that. I think it's because this model is ancient. This was introduced in 1979. That makes it over 40 years old, so it's a dated model. Also, when this was transformed into the Hornby Thomas, it was modified quite significantly. So when you combine those modifications with the extreme age of this model, you've got an E2 that is not very realistic. You've got an E2 that is not very E2-like. And I think if Hornby called this an E2, then people would start comparing this with the real E2s. They would start saying how unrealistic it is. And Hornby, I think, ultimately would be criticised for it. So I think by plopping this in the railroad range, giving it an SECR livery, which the E2s never carried, and calling it just a generic 060 tank engine, avoids all of those issues. And I think it's quite smart. And after the misleading packaging and marketing that we've seen from Hornby quite a bit recently, it's actually quite refreshing to see them be so candid with a model like this. And to be honest with you, I'm quite looking forward to seeing this model in the SECR green. Now, I've got the old E2 behind me in the LBSC Umber there, and I do think that would sell well if Hornby brought it back. I hope that they do at some point. But onto this model. It is in the Hornby Railroad range, as you can see by the packaging, and as we know, those models are supposed to be simpler and less expensive than the main Hornby Railways range. It's just a pity that Hornby kind of forgot that last bit about them being cheaper, because the latest RRP for this is £66.99, nearly £70 for this ancient 1979 locomotive. That is absolutely ridiculous. This is supposed to be a starter model. How are people supposed to get into the hobby with such a high price as that? When this was first announced, I managed to pre-order it for £49 something, and now it's got up 20% and it ended up costing me £60 from Model Railways Direct. That's an awful lot of money, isn't it? But we'll see what it's like. Maybe it's seen some upgrades, maybe Hornby have modified it. It certainly hasn't been seen as a non-Thomas model in a good number of years. So let's take a look, let's see what this is like. Right, I've done quite a lot of waffling already then, so I think we need to crack on and take a look. Let me show you the end of the box then. So the product code for this is R30039. It is an SECR 060 locomotive, so like I say, they're keeping it very generic, and it's SECR number 326. And I did look up that locomotive and found nothing. I'm not saying there wasn't ever an SECR 326, but I did not find one. There was some sort of 044 tank engine from the 1800s that had that number, possibly, but I don't think this is supposed to be that either. Right, so we've got nothing on the back of the box to speak of, so let's pull this out and see. The main thing for me is, has this model changed? It's certainly double the price it used to be. The packaging is a little bit different. It's in like a paper shell, which makes sense because, you know, it's not particularly detailed or complex. An accessories bag is there, which we'll look at in a minute. But let's take a look at the operating and maintenance guide. So this is very generic yet again. Locomotives with the Type M motor, I mean, there's loads of those. Alright, so it does seem to be the fairly basic stuff. Lubrication shows you where to put the oil if you need to do that. Body removal, yeah, it's just a snap fit body. Chassis / motor, notice on the end of the box there was no mention of this being DCC ready, yet I think for £60 the DCC version of this chassis would be the one I would expect to see inside. Don't think that's going to be the case now though, is it? Looking at the end of the box. Putting the body back on, that's all fair enough. More generic information on the back, okay. Accessories then, I think I saw quite a nice little touch in here, and indeed I did. So again, this makes no sense. A Hornby Railroad loco, very basic, low detail, and yet it comes with a set of crew. How many Hornby locos come with crew? Almost none of them. Yet this one does. Unpainted, of course, although if you wanted to, you could paint them. And there's also a couple of vacuum pipes that you can fit to the loco buffer beams, if that's what you want to do. Okay, let's have a look then. How am I going to do this? Oh, we can peel it back. So, our first look at the SECR Railroad Edition livery. All right, let's pull it out. All right. So quite obviously this is a very stripped down version of the SECR livery. The banding on the boiler is noticeably very, very simple. It is just a single colour. There's none of that red that we see on the higher spec liveries. But again, to an extent that kind of makes sense. This is a Hornby Railroad locomotive, and if this was for sale for £30 or so, which in my opinion is what this model is worth, then the stripped down livery would be completely okay. However, because this model is being sold for double what it's worth, according to me, it is a bit disappointing, to be honest, that the livery is so simple. I would have quite liked to have seen a bit more complexity in the lining. As it is though, it doesn't look bad. Yeah, I do actually quite like this. I love the sort of dark reddish colour of the running plate and such. Yeah, it's a welcome change from the LBSC livery. So we're going to have a bit of history on the E2. Not that this is an E2. No, of course it isn't. No, it's a generic 060 from the SECR. But either way, it's clearly an E2, so we're going to call it an E2, and we're going to hear about the E2 back in the day. So let's get started. The London and Brighton Class E2 was a pre-grouping tank engine introduced in 1913 to the design of L.B. Billington. This design ran on 2 inside cylinders, producing a tractive effort of 94 kilonewtons, and would later be classified as a 3F locomotive by British Railways. These engines were mainly used for heavy shunting or short distance freight, although their very limited coal capacity made them very unsuitable for anything longer than that. It was for this reason that a 1914 push-pull passenger trail failed. They just couldn't carry enough coal to sustain the journeys. Following the grouping of 1923, the class fell into Southern Railway ownership and later British Railways from 1948 onwards. I couldn't find any reference of the E2 being operated under the SECR or carrying an SECR livery at any point. Please do comment down below if you know any different though. 10 were constructed in total, and all examples survived up until 1961, which is when withdrawal finally began. Ultimately, all examples were scrapped and none of them were preserved. So there it is, up close and personal for you. The Hornby SECR E2, sounds so wrong, up close and personal for you. And simple as this model undoubtedly is, I do quite like it. There is something quite cool about this livery. However, I am going to stick to my original theory about Hornby not calling this an E2 because frankly, it doesn't look like an E2 anymore. This version of the model clearly has all of the same detail that the Hornby Thomas had, and not that the original E2 had. And presumably when Hornby converted that E2 model into their Thomas model, the toolings were changed permanently, and to modify the toolings again to make this look more like an E2 would probably have been quite expensive and time consuming, and so presumably this was deemed to be the more cost-effective option, which, like I say, makes complete sense. Having said that, it is a pity then that this has been sold so expensively, given how clearly cheap this was to produce. You would think, given how expensive Hornby's new tooled models are, that this really old locomotive would have been a great opportunity to produce something really cheap for those who are less well off to enjoy, and yet that opportunity was missed yet again. Let's go into some more detail then on the differences between this and the original E2. Clearly this has the Thomas tanks, the extended tank at the front there, and it also has the detail from Thomas on the top there. It doesn't have the extras that the original E2 had. This they could have gotten away with though, because obviously the real E2s did have their tanks extended in real life at one point in order to increase their water capacity, so that would have been okay. The chimney though is noticeably very different. This has the Thomas chimney. The original E2 model had a much larger chimney, and that really changes the model, doesn't it? I think if you look at them side by side, that makes a big difference, even if you don't realise that it is the chimney that makes that difference. This SECR model has the Thomas whistles on the front there. It doesn't have the original E2 safety valve, which would be there where the whistles were, and then the E2 whistle was up on top of the cab, whereas this cab is completely clear. The coal bunker on this is the Thomas coal bunker, not the slightly more elegant looking E2 coal bunker that the original model had. And of course this model is missing the extra detail at the front of the tanks, including the Westinghouse pump, which is a glaring omission. And instead, of course, you've got the Thomas splashes, which the E2 never had. Again, the metal handrails looked pretty good on the original E2 model, but those were removed for Thomas, and that's the case here. And the same is true of the smoke box door. I don't know what they did with the original smoke box door tooling, but clearly this is not it, and this is missing the handrail from that as well. To me, the smoke box door doesn't even look straight. Yeah, it's definitely a few degrees anti-clockwise, isn't it? Definitely. So significantly different from the original E2, you can clearly see why Hornby have not marketed this as an E2. Let's talk about the model in itself though. So quite lightweight, 148 grams, and that's because the body is entirely plastic. That's including the running plate and even right down to the buffers, which I also believe are plastic. The whistles here are actually metal, which is a nice touch, but I think that is probably literally it for the bodywork. Very light locomotive. The finish is obviously quite plasticky. Again, as a railroad locomotive, that's not a huge deal, but I did want to mention it. And as you can see, yes, the lining is very simplified on the boiler. The side tanks, where the SECR lettering is, and also the side of the coal bunker, where the running number is. Yeah, it's very, very basic. It's fair enough, but obviously basic. I do like the coloured running plate, as I say, even though it's made of plastic. And the wheels are also very simple. Again, wouldn't this have looked amazing with the proper SECR lined wheels? As it is though, these are just plain green and they don't even have the axles covered, so they look very unrealistic. One surprise is the buffer beams, because clearly the vacuum pipes were provided separately, and yet the factory have still fitted the vacuum pipes to the model. That's very strange. Again, that just kind of suggests that this was rushed out without that much thought. No big deal. The vacuum pipes included in the accessories bag will make for great spares, so obviously that's not a complaint. I do like the dome. I have to say the dome looks good. It's not electroplated, so it doesn't have the full metallic finish to it, but this is definitely glossier and better quality than we've seen from SECR locos in the past, so that is pretty decent. The cab detail is very, very basic. There is some detail inside, but none of it is painted, and we don't have any glazing on the windows or anything, although there is that grille effect on the rear windows, which is almost obscured by the coal bunker, but you can just about see it. Besides that, the couplings, yeah, I mean, we're back in the dark ages, folks. No NEM provisions here. This is just a screwed large D-type tension lock coupling. No real way to change those unless you can find another coupling with similar fittings that you can put on instead. For £66.99 RRP or for £60.30, it's a complete rip-off, really, isn't it? It's not a quality loco, it's not a quality livery. It's very, very old and ancient, and it doesn't really resemble anything in real life. So, I don't know, it's cool. I am glad I bought it, but really this thing ought to have been cheaper. It really is not worth the money. In fact, it's probably about twice as expensive as it really ought to be. Okay, let's get this down onto the track then. We'll see how it runs. Hopefully, it will be a decent performer. So there she is down onto the track. Yeah, it's quite cool to see a pre-grouping loco in the railroad range. I've got to give it to Hornby for that. Anyway, first performance test has been filmed and I'll show you the results in just a second. Next, I went on and did my deep dive into the mechanism, and yeah, this is the basic Hornby 060 chassis. You've probably seen it before, so I'm not going to go into masses of detail. However, let's do the basics. First of all, no rubber traction tyres. Sometimes the Hornby Thomas locos did have traction tyres, this one doesn't, and I do think that's best. However, combine the lack of rubber traction tyres with the extreme lightweight of the loco, we're not going to get a great puller here. The body removal is a little bit fiddly, but it can be done by inserting a flat screwdriver into the back of the loco and disengaging the clip. Then you can get the base keeper off if you want to, for servicing, maintenance purposes, etc. Quite a few screws, the couplings have to come off as well, but then the base does come off to reveal proper turned metal bearings on the axles. So again, it's a good mechanism. Hornby are known for quality mechanisms, and here we've got a Hornby Railroad loco, again with proper bearings. That's exactly as it should be for over £60, but let's recognise that, I think. The chassis itself is incredibly basic. It is die-cast, but it's obviously not that substantial. This is just a cheap 3-pole motor. It doesn't have any flywheel or anything. And as you can also see, there is no DCC socket on board, which means this loco is not DCC ready. Very simple pickups as well, on all of the wheels though, so that's okay. And then the gauging is 14.1 to 14.2, so a little bit under gauge, but that's normally not much of a problem. So that's the mechanism. It's very bare bones, isn't it? I mean, for 30 quid like these used to sort of cost, that's fine. These days for 60 quid, it's lacking a little bit really, isn't it? Anyway, let me show you how the performance went. Okay, let's see how this runs. Of course, I've tested locos with this chassis many times before, so I've got some idea, but let's actually try a loco manufactured in 2022. Here we go. Does it work? Forwards, 50. Yes, it does work. It doesn't sound very healthy. It certainly doesn't. And it's cut out. It's not been running yet though, to be fair. It will have a good run before I sort of deem it a rubbish runner. But again, you know, over 60 quid, it's got to be a decent runner. And yeah, I'm sure it will be. Yeah, it probably will become one. Let's keep going with it, up and down. The speed seems fair enough. I mean, that's 50. It's not too fast, is it? Let's get it 50. Yeah. Yeah, it's not too fast. It seems probably more or less about right. And I tell you what, I've had some pretty good crawls out of these chassis as well. So let's see what that's like at the moment. Easing it up. Yeah. I mean, that's not bad, is it? So at last we're starting to see some value here. This is performing like a 60 quid model should. Really nice crawl. Yeah, look at that. Can we go slower? A little bit. It's a bit coggy there, but I think these are still the same 3-pole motors that they've always been. I always think they perform really well for how cheap they are. Again, these motors, £1, £2. I've bought exactly the same thing direct from China at that sort of price, and that was with it being shipped to my door, you know, so not expensive motors, but they do the job. In terms of pickups though, yeah, it's cutting out quite a bit. That's the second time I've had to help it out, and it wasn't even on a point when it cut out. So yeah, I'm hoping running in will definitely loosen this one up. Hopefully it will wear the pickups in a bit so they don't keep cutting out, losing connection. Then yeah, I think it will be a decent runner. So let's set it to forwards. Let's see how it gets on around the track. So already I would say that's faster. Yeah, now it does seem quite speedy, and yet that low end crawl still absolutely fantastic. So, you know, it's absolutely fine. It's a Hornby Railroad loco, and to be honest, it's running about as well as you'd expect a Hornby Railroad loco to run. For 30 quid, this would be very impressive indeed. For 60 plus, yeah, it's about right, isn't it, in terms of performance? Seems to be quite a good runner. At the moment, it's not an outstanding runner, but if after running in it stops cutting out and becomes a little bit smoother perhaps, and maybe even quietens down a little bit, then yeah, the performance will be absolutely fine. But I'll leave it to it. We'll keep this running in for the time being, and I'll see you in just a second. Okay folks, there we go, I am back. Running in is complete, and it's a bit of a mixed bag really. At 50% speed it was absolutely fine, no noticeable slowdowns, and even though it did sort of stutter over the points, it wasn't stopping on them. At the lower speeds though, it really struggles at some points, and you'll see this later on, but yeah, it's starting to sort of stutter a little bit. I don't think there's a torque issue, there seems to be plenty of torque there. I can probably demonstrate that. Yeah, I mean, that's not a problem. So I assume it's just the pickups. I don't know why the pickups seem so unreliable. It's a wide wheelbase loco. The pickups themselves seem absolutely fine. But these Railroad 060s are quite prone to it, unfortunately. I remember I had a couple of DCC fitted ones from a train set, and they were just completely unusable on DCC because every time they went over a point, they would stop dead and have to restart again. So they're just prone to it, unfortunately. The pulling power, as you'd expect, is not fantastic, 0.19 newtons, although that should be enough for this to haul around 14 coaches on straight and level track. But as a freight locomotive, I've set up some open wagons, not a huge number of them, but enough to give this loco a bit of a test. Don't want that motor burning out like it did in my Hornby Thomas. So let's see what the performance is like now that it's running. Let's see what the crawl is like. I would say that's more or less about the same, a little bit coggy, but for a 3-pole motor, incredibly impressive. Let's see if it can get over these points without stopping. I don't think it will. Oh, it might do. Ooh, nice. But it won't get over the next one. Let's see that. Oh. It's actually doing remarkably well though. It's definitely more reliable now than it was when I first started it. But yeah, it stops on this point all the time. I'm not entirely sure why. Wait for it. It's going to be the back wheel. Oh, there we go. Let's go and couple, shall we? Oh, 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 steady. Right, so despite all this loco's faults, I mean, it should be capable of doing a smooth coupling. Let's see if that's true. Keep it steady. I think we got it there. I doubt the hooks have engaged properly because, again, this coupling is strictly not compatible with the modern slim tension locks. Of course, you can use them, but it's not ideal. And I don't know, we'll see if we get any derailments. I think we might. Right, here we go. Let's see. Not too fast. Let's keep it fairly steady. Come on. All right. So, middle line, we've got the E2 locomotive that I've talked about so much today. And I know it was a freight loco, but this has got some passenger coaches. Nice steady runner. Something's gone wrong with the SECR one again. We'll go and look at that in a moment, but on the inside line I've got Hornby Thomas. There we go, which is of course what happened to the original E2 model after Hornby converted it. Yeah, so it's a derailment at the point where the modern tension lock coupling meets the large D-shaped one. I'm going to back all this up, get it back on the track and see if it happens again. Alright, let's observe this carefully. Around the curves. Oh, yeah. Pop right off. So, because that coupling on the loco is fixed, it doesn't pivot or anything, even though it's quite a long loco, it's just going to throw wagons off like that. So I'm going to try and find some sort of wagon with a matching coupling and see if that fixes the issue. Alright, let's go again. We've got a Hornby van on there this time. Still a nasty slowdown there, I don't know why. But crucially, no derailment. And obviously the SECR wagon is staying on the track now as well, because the box van is so much shorter than the loco, so it doesn't swing its coupling out so much. So there you can get away with it. It's not convenient though, is it really? I don't really understand why Hornby don't just upgrade their old models so that everything Hornby sells has the same coupling and it all just works together. It's a right faff having to try and find certain bits of rolling stock that can handle these large D-type couplings without any pivoting on them. So yeah, it's okay, it's okay. As you can see at this sort of speed, it's handling the train just fine. Doesn't seem to have any torque issues, like I say, but occasionally it does slow down and struggle a little bit. But as a starter loco, I think it performs adequately. It's nothing to shout about, but you know, these Hornby 060s, they've always been fine, and this one's fine as well. Yeah, it's not outstanding, and I think for 60 quid it could have been better, obviously, but it is what it is, and it seems to do the job more or less. Don't forget to keep an eye on the other sidings and such. There is a duplicate loco out there somewhere, so if you spot two locos of the same class, comment down below and I will pin the first correct answer. Let's have some ratings then for the Hornby SECR 060, and as you can see the scores are not great here. Now to an extent that's fine, this is supposed to be a basic low spec loco, but in 2022 even a basic low spec loco needs to perform well, be compatible with modern rolling stock and also be priced reasonably, and I don't think this is any of those. The level of detail for me is 1.5 star. This part is understandable as a railroad loco at least. Very, very simple livery, missing quite a lot of detail that the original E2 had. No cab detail, no sprung buffers. Yeah, it's a basic one, so 1.5 star for me. Performance is quite a lot better actually. The crawl is really quite good. It's nice and smooth at the higher speeds, but it is quite a noisy one, unfortunately. It does cog quite a bit at the lower speeds, slow as it is. It does cut out quite a lot as well, not the most reliable, even though it's got pickups on each wheel. Quite inconsistent at the lower speeds as well, around curves and such, and obviously because the couplings are so outdated they don't interface very well with modern rolling stock. So 3 is the best I can do there. Pulling power is not great, 0.19 newtons. It's a light loco without a traction tyre, so that's pretty much as expected, not that impressive though. The mechanism is a 2.5 star, again just a 3-pole motor, very cheap one, no flywheel, no DCC socket. However, there are proper bearings on the driving wheels, which is great. No traction tyres, which again does affect the pulling power, but overall I think that's a quality feature. I would rather a loco just rely on its weight, and it does have all-wheel pickup, so that's fine. The quality, no major problem with the quality. I mean, to be fair, it was built nicely. There's no visible glue, everything seems to fit together okay. It is plastic right down to the buffers, so you can forget any mention of a die-cast running plate or anything like that. But you know, that's pretty much fair enough, I would say, for a Hornby Railroad loco. The value for money though is where this falls down. RRP £66.99, that is anything but a nice price. And £60.30 is what I paid for this from Model Railways Direct. Yeah, I mean these Hornby Railroad 060s used to be available for what, 30 quid or less, and that wasn't all that long ago. Now I know inflation is a thing, but we haven't seen over 100% inflation over the past few years, so it's not really good enough to just blame that. These models are now older and even more outdated than they were a few years ago. Why they've doubled in price, I just don't understand. It's a basic beginner's loco, I just think it should be priced as such, and pricing starter locos like this is just bad for the hobby, isn't it? It's just going to put people off, and that's a great shame. Okay, overall that's 5.14 out of 10, into the logbook it goes, and yeah, it's down at the bottom, 45th place next to the ex-Hornby Percy. I think this is a slightly better loco, but obviously not by much. Well folks, we have come to the end of yet another review. Honestly, it is quite good to see Hornby add to the railroad range. This loco hasn't been around for quite a few years, and so it's good to see it back again, particularly in a pre-grouping livery. That is awesome. I don't think this is going to happen, but I would love to see it come back in an LBSC Umber livery with a little bit more intricacy in the paintwork. I can't see Hornby doing that, unfortunately, but wouldn't that be great? Even better, they could modify the tooling so that it looked a little bit like the original E2 and did the proper livery, then that would be amazing. But you've got to think if they're going to go to that sort of trouble, then a full retool would probably be the best way to go. And maybe we'll see that from Hornby one day. If another manufacturer announces an E2, then you can bet your bottom dollar that Hornby's going to do it. But yeah, either way, this one, it's okay. It's not particularly realistic, not really very affordable, not quite as good as it ought to be for the price, but it is sort of functional. Even that is a bit of a stretch because it's not that functional. But yeah, with the right rolling stock, it's functional. Not that impressed, as you can probably tell. But if you're interested, yeah, go check it out. I'll pop some links in the description if you want to get one, but ultimately, yeah, not that fantastic, is it? Alright folks, well thank you very much for watching. I'll see you very, very soon. Alright, cheers folks.